General Hospital spoilers reveal that a storm of recalibration is quietly brewing beneath Sonny's calm exterior, signaling a critical shift in his instincts and tactics. For a man who has long ruled through intuition, code, and brute influence, the latest developments involving Sidwell have forced Sonny into a state of heightened calculation. There is a growing sense that Sonny's usual methods, relying on loyalty, muscle, and implicit trust, are no longer enough to navigate the increasingly convoluted web of betrayals, secrets, and covert operations unfolding around him. What emerges now is a Sonny who is adapting in real time, orchestrating a series of strategic adjustments that may ultimately redefine not only his empire but the very essence of who he is. At the center of these adjustments lies one elusive, incendiary truth. Sidwell possesses a piece of evidence that could ignite everything. The whispers have grown louder, and Sonny, who once dismissed Sidwell as a political nuisance, now recognizes him as a direct threat. Rumors suggest that Sidwell has obtained sensitive data, perhaps tied to the WSB, Jason, or even hidden elements of the Corinthos family's past, that, if released, could tear through what remains of Sonny's grip on the city's balance. This isn't just about protecting his legacy anymore, it's about surviving the storm before it hits. Sonny's actions are no longer reactive, they're surgical. He is quietly reassessing his alliances, demanding silence where there was once open discussion, and shifting power dynamics behind closed doors. His surveillance network is expanding beyond Port Charles, into federal circles, WSB vaults, and private investigators who owe him not in money, but in blood. The goal is simple yet dangerously elusive. He wants the full truth about Sidwell's evidence before it's weaponized. And more than that, he wants to know who gave it to him, why, and what the ultimate target is. But Sonny's transformation isn't just a response to Sidwell, it's an evolution triggered by the erosion of trust in his own inner circle. The fallout with Carly, the unpredictability of Michael, Jason's unsettling re-emergence, and the sudden silences from associates like Curtis and Drew have shown Sonny that even his tightest bonds can splinter under pressure. Now, with Sidwell looming like a silent puppet master, Sonny realizes he must return to the part of himself that existed before the Corinthos name became synonymous with control, the calculating, unforgiving survivor forged in betrayal and war. This current phase of adjustment is not public. To most of Port Charles, Sonny appears as steady and composed as ever. But behind that mask is a man tracing every thread, analyzing every move, watching every friend as if they might be a traitor. He's no longer trusting words, he's chasing proof. He doesn't want assumptions, he wants evidence, and he will burn down every corridor of power to find it. What Sidwell is holding might be tied to the biochemical operations that Jason and the WSB have tried to suppress. It might be connected to criminal operations falsely attributed to Sonny himself. Or perhaps it exposes financial manipulations that draw a dangerous line from Drew to corrupt federal players. Whatever it is, Sonny knows it will not just shake foundations, it will destroy them. And so Sonny recalibrates. He sends Dex on quiet missions without informing Brick. He requests old contacts from Puerto Rico to track Sidwell's past without alerting Diane. He even considers confiding in someone he once distrusted deeply, Anna Devane, knowing she may have pieces of Sidwell's dossier that no one else does. These are not the moves of a man panicking. They are the moves of a man adapting with deadly precision. This isn't just about Sidwell anymore. It's about what Sidwell represents, a future that Sonny didn't control, secrets he didn't authorize, and consequences he may not survive. Every decision Sonny makes now is a move on a chessboard where the rules are changing by the hour. And with each new discovery, with every confirmation of betrayal or weakness, Sonny becomes something more dangerous than a crime boss. He becomes a man with nothing left to lose but everything left to prove. The adjustment Sonny is undergoing is not a pause, it is a transformation. And when he finally uncovers what Sidwell is hiding, it won't be justice he seeks. It will be reckoning. And Port Charles will never be the same again. Sonny could feel the shift before it was ever spoken aloud, the tightening of the air around him. The unease in every corner of Port Charles that mirrored the turbulence growing in his gut. It wasn't just instinct anymore, it was a visceral sense that something beneath the surface had ruptured. And now the slow, silent flood was beginning to rise. He had weathered betrayal before, had carved an empire from nothing but blood and loyalty, but this was different. This wasn't a single act of disloyalty or a misguided enemy in the shadows. This was a recalibration of the entire world around him, a systemic unraveling, marked by new rules, unfamiliar players, and revelations designed to crush even the most invincible name in the city. Sonny Corinthos was not just fighting to stay on top. He was now fighting to understand the very foundation on which his world was built, and more importantly, who was quietly moving to destroy it. There was no single moment that triggered the sense of dread creeping in. Rather, it was 1,000 small things, a whisper between old allies that grew just a little too silent when he entered the room, a delay in communication from Curtis that once would have come instantly. The offhand mention of new federal interests asking the wrong questions about the Sidwell case. And then came the realization that the people Sonny once counted on to shield him from political crossfire were no longer in position, or worse, no longer interested. The WSB was moving. Jason was keeping secrets, and Carly, once the fire in his veins, had become distant in ways he could no longer rationalize. These weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a design, one that seemed intent on forcing him to either evolve or perish. The obsession that had taken root in Sonny wasn't born from paranoia, it was born from clarity. He began to trace the connections between Sidwell's sudden appearance and the internal instability spreading within the Corinthos organization. There were too many unknowns. How had Sidwell acquired sealed WSB intelligence? Why was Jason refusing to reveal the full scope of his involvement with the agency? And why, of all people, was Michael suddenly cooperating with Curtis and offering half-truths about Jacinda's potential testimony? It didn't make sense. Unless it was never meant to. Unless Sonny had been maneuvered into this position, not by enemies, but by people who once called him family. The adjustments Sonny found himself making was not one of minor recalibration. It was wholesale reconstruction. He no longer acted on faith. He demanded verification. Every loyalty was tested. Every memory revisited. Every piece of information filtered through the cold, brutal lens of survival. And what he began to uncover sent shockwaves through the very soul of his empire. Sidwell was not acting alone. The documents he possessed, if real, tied Sonny to biochemical crimes orchestrated through shell corporations Sonny had never heard of, companies with deep links to Drew, Jason, and an unnamed operative presumed to be Jacinda herself. If these were falsified, it was a masterful job. If they were real, Sonny was at the center of a storm far more dangerous than any mafia turf war. And then there was the matter of Sasha. Her breakdown had been a tragedy, yes, but Sonny had always sensed there was more to it. Now, as threads began to align, he saw the devastating potential in what was once unthinkable. Sasha had been used. Weaponized. Someone had manipulated her mental health crisis into a cover for transferring sensitive data, likely tied to Daisy, Wiley, or even Nina. The implications were staggering, and Sonny could feel his control slipping, not from weakness, but from the sheer number of fronts he was now fighting on. The obsession grew. Sonny began reviewing old conversations, pulling footage, demanding access to surveillance he never used to need. He stopped trusting silence. He stopped believing in chance. And he started digging. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Drew had met with Sidwell months before any public sightings. Jason had been in contact with federal agents under a false alias. And Carly. Carly had been offered immunity from future prosecution if she surrendered Sonny's offshore accounts. She hadn't taken the deal, not yet. But the offer was out there. And Sonny knew it was only a matter of time before everyone who claimed to love him was forced to make a choice. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a mutiny dressed in soft apologies and half-kept promises. What made it worse, what made it almost unbearable, was that Sonny could feel himself changing. He wasn't the same man who once ruled Port Charles through charisma and fear. He was something else now. Harder. Colder. And yet, more desperate than ever to protect what remained. The love for Donna. The legacy for Avery. The need to prove to himself that the man they had tried to dismantle was still unbreakable. Every step he took now was fueled not just by strategy, but by fury. Controlled. Calculating fury. The adjustment, in the end, was not about power, it was about clarity. Sonny finally saw the game for what it was. The players were no longer thugs or rivals. They were people who knew him. People who had built his empire with him, and who now seemed all too eager to see it fall. The obsession would not pass. The transformation would not reverse. Sonny was not retreating, he was ascending into a version of himself none of them would be ready for. Because when the final truth about Sidwell comes out, when the betrayal is no longer theoretical but written in blood and contracts and wire transfers, Sonny will not forgive. He will not forget. And he will not rebuild. He will burn everything they touched. And he will start over on the ashes of the lies. The tension between Sonny and Sidwell had reached a fever pitch that no one in Port Charles could have predicted, let alone control. What began as mere whispers of government interference had now evolved into a full-scale shadow war, one built not on gunfire and street fights, but on data, deception, and psychological warfare. Sidwell was unlike any adversary Sonny had faced before. He wasn't a mob rival staking territory or a rogue agent looking for fast power. He was a man embedded deeply in the bureaucratic veins of the WSB, armed with technology, influence, and cold ambition. And the most terrifying part? Sidwell wasn't chasing Sonny's empire for glory. He wanted to dismantle Sonny's life piece by piece until nothing remained, not reputation, not family, not legacy. It became clear the moment Sonny intercepted the first leaked document. A vague financial ledger traced to an offshore account. Then came the surveillance footage, grainy but clear enough to raise questions. Footage of Deck's meeting with Jason, and shortly after, Carly leaving a discreet safe house in Brooklyn, just before Drew's controversial arrest. These weren't coincidences. This was precision. Sidwell was orchestrating a methodical campaign. Collecting data and P. But Sonny wasn't blind to the storm building. He knew the signs. The sudden coldness from Jason, the hesitation in Carly's eyes. Even the way Dante paused longer than usual when discussing WSB activity. Sidwell was driving a wedge between every bond Sonny had built, starting with trust. But Sonny wasn't going to wait until everything crumbled to retaliate. Instead, he launched his own operation, using the same quiet tactics Sidwell employed. Brick traced encrypted phone calls to a WSB outpost in Virginia. Spinelli flagged unusual access logs on several Port Charles medical records, most involving Nina, Willow, and Sasha. Sonny realized then that Sidwell wasn't just targeting him, he was exploiting everyone Sonny cared about. And just as Sonny suspected, the real bombshell came when he discovered Sidwell's manipulation of Wiley. The child had been placed into several casual therapy sessions arranged under a shell foundation linked to Sidwell's network. In those sessions, Wiley had been guided to speak about his father, his home, his new sister, and even the things he'd heard about Sasha. Sonny, furious, watched hours of hidden footage and saw firsthand the subtle psychological manipulation Sidwell's people had inflicted. This wasn't intelligence gathering. This was strategic emotional warfare designed to fracture the Corinthos family from the inside out. Meanwhile, Sidwell kept his public face clean, never directly accusing, never making overt moves. Instead, he let allies like Drew take the heat. Sonny knew Drew was compromised, whether by ego, desperation, or guilt, but it didn't matter. The damage was already spreading. Willow, reeling from betrayal after betrayal, had unknowingly fed Sidwell's operation with every confessional tear she shed. Michael, convinced he was reclaiming autonomy, had unknowingly opened a path for Sidwell's data infiltration when he took over the Corinthos side accounts. And Carly, now isolated from Jason's increasingly erratic decisions, found herself wondering whether the life she thought she was preserving had already been rewritten. The final straw came when Sonny confronted Jason. It wasn't a screaming match or a violent altercation, it was quiet, devastating. Jason didn't deny the existence of Sidwell's operation. He didn't admit allegiance either. But his silence was enough. Jason was compromised, conflicted, and spiraling. Sonny realized then that the future he'd been trying to preserve, the one where his family, flawed as they were, still stood together, was a fantasy. Sidwell had weaponized the truth. And once truth becomes a tool, it no longer brings clarity. It brings destruction. With nowhere left to retreat emotionally, Sonny did what he did best, he went on the offensive. He called in old favors from outside Port Charles, individuals who owed him not just loyalty, but life debts. Within days, he had blueprints of Sidwell's safe houses, transcripts of encrypted WSB briefings, and most importantly, a list of assets Sidwell was protecting. One name stood out, Jacinda. Curtis had recently mentioned her return. Sonny now realized her appearance wasn't spontaneous, it was staged. Sidwell had placed her back into the equation as a tool, perhaps even bait. To turn Curtis into a liability or perhaps to further destabilize Drew. Curtis, having pieced together parts of this puzzle on his own, approached Sonny with a proposition: if Jacinda was the key, then they needed to pull her out of Sidwell's grasp. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about containment. Sonny agreed. But there would be no extraction until Sidwell knew that Sonny was ready to set fire to everything he loved, including the illusion of stability he had constructed for his Port Charles facade. Sonny didn't just want to beat Sidwell. He wanted Sidwell to know he had lost control. The next move came unexpectedly, not from Sonny directly, but through Sasha. Sasha had been quietly rebuilding herself after her descent into madness and loss. But she, too, had seen through Sidwell's reach. And when she discovered a string of messages in Nina's tablet, messages that confirmed Sidwell had manipulated her breakdown into a political tool, she finally snapped. Her tearful confession to Willow, combined with proof Sonny handed her, exposed not just Nina's betrayal, but Sidwell's strategy. It all came crashing down. Willow collapsed, emotionally wrecked by the triple blow of Drew's deceit, Nina's manipulation, and Sidwell's overarching influence. And somewhere, in a dim surveillance room, Sidwell watched without blinking, realizing he had gone too far. Sonny's trap was now complete. With the family splintered, with Jason unraveling, and with Michael questioning everything, Sonny staged a final confrontation. He didn't bring threats. He brought evidence. He sat across from Sidwell, handed him a dossier with names, financial links, operations, and said only this: I burn, you disappear. Sidwell, for the first time, flinched. Not because Sonny had more power, but because Sonny had finally become untethered from everything that had once made him predictable. A man with nothing left to protect is the most dangerous kind. The aftermath would be messy. Jason would have to choose a side. Michael would face the truth about Wiley's trauma. Willow, already deteriorating from stress, would receive another devastating diagnosis: her cancer had returned. And as if fate delighted in cruelty, Amelia would be diagnosed with a rare condition that would tether Willow even deeper into emotional chaos. But Sonny remained steady. His empire, fractured though it was, would endure. Because he understood now that Port Charles had changed. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about control of the narrative. And Sonny, despite the odds, had seized it back. Sidwell may still be watching, still plotting, but he would do so knowing that Sonny had looked into the abyss and decided to drag him down with him. This was no longer about survival. It was about domination. And Sonny Corinthos, bruised, bleeding, but unbroken, had just declared war on every ghost in the machine. Sonny was standing at the brink of something seismic, an opportunity not merely to reclaim what had been stripped from him, but to reassert his dominance in a town that had begun to forget who truly controlled the shadows of Port Charles. For months, he had been battered by betrayal. His empire chipped away by quiet conspiracies, manipulative government agents, and the painful unraveling of his own family. Yet now, amidst the wreckage, a new opening emerged, one that ignited a different fire in Sonny, not just driven by vengeance but by clarity, a realization that the time for silent endurance was over. This was a turning point born not from strategy alone, but from the chaos that had engulfed everyone around him and now left them with no choice but to circle back to the one man who had always known how to survive the storm. The adjustment began with a whisper, a signal between allies who had once doubted each other. Michael, who had turned his back on Sonny in moments of righteous fury, now found himself cornered by larger threats that made old grievances seem meaningless. He had seen firsthand the manipulation behind the scenes, the way Sidwell had orchestrated divisions, poisoned relationships, and jeopardized the safety of Wiley and Amelia under the guise of justice and political warfare. Michael realized the truth the hard way: in a world ruled by shadows, only those who understood the darkness could truly protect the ones they loved. And Sonny, as flawed as he might be, had always known how to wield that darkness to his advantage. Jason, too, was beginning to crack beneath the weight of his dual allegiances. Torn between loyalty to the WSB and his unbreakable connection to Sonny, he could no longer ignore the wreckage around him. He had seen the psychological damage inflicted on Sasha, watched Willow crumble under the weight of secrets, and stood in silence as Nina's betrayals cascaded into devastation for everyone. Jason understood that silence now equated to complicity. The time had come to act, not as an agent, not as a ghost in the machine, but as the enforcer Sonny always trusted him to be. Together, the three men moved like an old engine restarting after years of disuse, rusted at first, but unstoppable once in motion. Sonny pulled strings that had long lain dormant. He summoned favors from the 5 families. He re-established lines of communication with former allies outside of Port Charles. He began tightening the flow of money, tracking every dollar tied to Sidwell's network. Michael used his business acumen to flag inconsistencies, exposing financial trails Sidwell had thought buried. Jason quietly extracted information from compromised WSB insiders, gathering classified intel that would put Sidwell on the defensive. What they uncovered wasn't just shocking, it was explosive. Sidwell hadn't only manipulated evidence, he had orchestrated a false flag operation involving the WSB, aiming to frame Sonny as a global threat. He had tied Sonny's name to shell companies linked to arms deals and human trafficking rings, hoping to trigger an international warrant that would allow him to arrest Sonny under the guise of protecting national security. But Sonny, with Jason's cold logic and Michael's intelligence network, flipped the script. They now possessed proof, not only of Sidwell's illegal tactics but of his attempt to weaponize innocent citizens, including Wiley, to push his narrative. The same man who had painted himself as the architect of order was revealed as the very embodiment of chaos. This revelation rocked Port Charles. Laura, blindsided by how deep the betrayal ran, found herself re-evaluating the city's political alliances. Curtis, still reeling from his failed partnership with Sidwell, began leaking information to Sonny's camp in secret. Sasha, empowered by her survival and determined to never be a pawn again, went public with her account of psychological abuse, exposing the WSB's unauthorized surveillance programs and putting a human face to the horrors Sidwell had enacted behind closed doors. Yet even as Sonny began to rebuild his dominion, the psychological toll of the past year remained etched across every decision he made. He was no longer the same man who ruled by fear alone. This was a more calculated, deeply wounded Sonny, one who now understood that loyalty wasn't just a commodity but a fragile, irreplaceable thread. His alliance with Michael was no longer based on blood alone but on the shared realization that family had to come before ego. His bond with Jason was reforged not through action, but through silent acknowledgement of past sins and the need to do better. Together, they weren't just fighting for power, they were fighting for restoration. The final move was both symbolic and tactical. Sonny staged a press event, publicly clearing his name and exposing the fabricated evidence Sidwell had planted. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply laid out the truth, with documents, testimonies, and unshakable composure. The city watched, spellbound, as the monster they had been taught to fear stood not as a criminal, but as the only man willing to clean up a mess the authorities had created. Sidwell, now backed into a corner, attempted one final desperate strike, leaking confidential WSB footage to the press, hoping to turn public opinion against Sonny once more. But it was too late. The people had seen too much, the truth had spread too far, and Sonny's control over the narrative was absolute. The agent who had once held all the cards was now isolated, abandoned by a government eager to cover its tracks. And so, Sonny stood at the edge of his reclaimed empire, not triumphant, but steady. He had learned that real power wasn't about control. It was about survival, about knowing who you are when the world tries to strip that identity away. With Michael beside him, finally understanding the weight his father had always carried, and with Jason once again standing at his side, Sonny was no longer just a figure in the shadows. He was the storm itself. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look uncertain, it looked like it belonged to him.